At the core, we are all children of imperfect parents. And then we grow up to become parents. And that perpetuates generationally some shame stories.
Hello, ladies, and maybe even a few gentlemen. I know there are some men who are listening to this podcast. I've heard rumors. This is Cherie Burton, and welcome to Women Seeking Wholeness. I absolutely eat for lunch discussions like Ganel-Lyn and I had on this episode. You are going to love it. It does not matter how old your children are, you're going to glean something from this. And again, even if you don't have children, you're totally going to get something from this because we talk about establishing a healthy family culture, and families are cults, let's be honest. And I talk about this in this episode because every family is its own little cult. It's hard to leave. You take on the programming, you believe, there's lots of layers to that. So healthy cult is what we're going for here. And I think you'll really enjoy how we climb into this. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on who you are and where you're at and what time zone and when you're listening to this. I am pumped about this episode. It's with my dear soul sister friend, Ganel-Lyn Condie. And say hi, Ganel-Lyn.
Hi. So happy to be with you on this new platform. I love it.
Oh, thank you. And I can't wait to share your platform. We are both launching podcasts at roughly the same time.
Which does not surprise me at all, given our parallel universe experiences.
Oh, that is so true. That is so true. So just as a brief intro on her, she's authored several books, and one of her, I guess you could call it a compilation book. What do you call that one?
That's what I would call it, as a compilation.
She asked me to write an essay on my experience of adopting Eli and Emma and placing a baby for adoption in her book, The Decision That Changed My Life. So that was really fun. But we've known each other for several years in varying circles. We were both on the pageant scene for a while, and we have boys that are same age that went to the same school, graduated the same, I think roughly the same time.
Yeah.
And so we just keep running into each other in all these different arenas. And when we get together and talk, like combustion happens.
Yeah, I know. That's why we have to have a pre-talk before we talk and record it, because I don't hide anything when I'm around you.
Well, and here's the thing about you, Ganel-Lyn. Also, you don't really hide your vulnerability.
I don't.
It's so refreshing. And we're going to kind of go there today.
Yeah.
But here's another thing we share. We both lost a sister to suicide.
Yep. Yes, we did.
Happened what year did your Megan?
So Meg was 5 years in March. So 2014.
Okay. So yours is a lot fresher. Shauna took her life in 2005. So we're coming up on 14 years this April. So I remember just hurting and aching for you because there's no pain like losing your sister that way.
Yeah. And I think it's a club that once you've experienced the grief, there's just like a second language that you understand about each other, and it changes your lens, which is probably my big why on leading out with authenticity and speaking and writing, because for me, it's a matter of life and death that we have to be more authentic to create connection, and connection saves lives. So that's my big why. So like, you were ahead of me on the trail. And for that, I'm so grateful, because especially when it comes to suicide, I'm not taking away from the grief others experience with other kinds of death, but it creates a vortex of a whole bunch of different questions and layers of grief and what ifs. And not, that doesn't show up usually as often in other grieving situations. So that's why it's a club, unfortunately, that is ever growing. But I love the work you've done around it, and I'm trying, and I love all the messengers that are trying on that front. I am cheering them on.
Thank you. And I applaud your work. I know you're really messaging around that when you speak to groups, because the people that seemingly present the most emotional healthiness typically are sometimes the ones who either have a close loved one struggling, or they themselves are doing everything they can to sort of hold it together.
Yes, for sure.
And I think we all vacillate on that spectrum, don't you think? I mean, all of us have days where we'd rather just stay in bed in fetal position and watch Netflix or something. I don't know.
Well, and I will say that was the first time after Meg's suicide those first few months for sure, but especially the first year. I remember not until the grief started to, I think of it as like the tide coming in and then going out. And as the tide went out, what was left was like, oh, there was a lot of grief seeping into every corner of my soul and heart. But it was the first time I thought, oh, if I didn't have like other children, and in some ways I talk to my friends that are therapists, I'm not overachiever. I do struggle with that sometimes, but overperformer. If I didn't have the anxiety of not showing up, I could see where I would stay in bed. Like the grief was so heavy that I was like, oh, this would be those times where you're like, yeah, I don't really care about showering and I don't really care about anything else because it settled into my bones. The grief did. It shook a core value belief that I think we're going to touch on today. And so it very much plays into my mothering, and she was more my daughter than she was my sister because I'm the oldest. And there was mental illness issues with our family, and my mom was a single mom, divorced with 2 little kids. And I just, from an early stage, believed that I could save her and anyone else I loved. And so suicide rocks that world big time. So
it totally does. And when Shauna died, she left behind 5 children, ranging in age from 2 to 12.
yeah.
And so I felt an immediate sense of protection for her children. And I was in the same community that she lived in. Anyway, it's so multifaceted. But the biggest thing that I have learned, and I know you'll resonate with this, is if you are really emotionally tied to someone who takes their life, when they die, you experience PTSD level trauma.
Oh, and I field a lot of questions and outreach during this season. I don't know when this episode will air, but unfortunately, people are missing the high risk time of the year. They think it's all during the holidays. It's actually starting around the end of February, early March through the end of spring. And there's a huge peak. That's the highest rate of suicide during these times, which I lost Meg in March. You lost Shauna in April. I can almost guess like 9 times out of 10 when someone says they've lost someone to suicide, it's during these months. And so I field a lot of calls and outreach and try to give support and language around it, whether it's an ecclesiastical leader or a family member or a friend that's trying to help, or it's someone on the edge. And I just took a call 2 days ago, and I didn't realize what was going on with me last night until this morning. And I went, oh, I had some PTSD going on today, and I have messaged about this probably over 700 times in 5 years in public events. I've helped the lieutenant governor. I've really worked this story through my soul. So it even surprises me still sometimes when I'm like, oh, I think that's some PTSD going on.
Absolutely. And this is where you and I also mirror, because when Shauna died, I was Mrs. Utah. So
yes,
I took on a more public role,
yes,
public flavor. So I was asked by the Utah Attorney General to sit on the State Suicide Prevention Council not because I was Mrs. Utah, but I have a background in psych, and I was in a public domain. And I researched suicide survivors. In other words, those who are the family members and direct loved ones around the person who suicides.
Right.
And that's interesting you say that about the season, because for them, it's rebirth. For them, it's renewal. It's moving on. It's transition.
Right.
So their soul is wanting a shift, wanting a change, wanting a transformation, if you will. And because they're in darkness, they perceive it to be death. Like Jesus and Easter and the resurrection, it's all themed around that.
Right.
So how interesting.
Right. Yeah.
Say that. Well, okay.
And I think the shifts, I think also, just to touch on that really quickly, if anyone's listening, because I've come to know that everyone falls into 3 categories. They struggle themselves with suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety. They love someone that does, or they've already lost someone, or they fall into all 3 categories. So I love that no matter where I'm messaging, I always tell groups, you will hear faith from me. It will be non-denominational if you would choose that. And you will hear a mention about suicide every time, because that covers everybody on the planet. So even if that's not our, heart of our topic today, I would just say, I think there's this holding on during the winter months and then this shift in the spring, and everyone thinks everyone's happy and fine. but it is like, I'm done. I can't hold on. So if anyone is listening to this and is struggling, especially moms that are in a very vulnerable stage of life, maybe because they're sleep deprived, they're taking care of young babies, postpartum, whatever that is, I would just say, just know we will never be better without you. Cherie and I are testaments of that. We're not better because Shauna and Meg aren't walking with us, even though we feel them on a spiritual level all the time. I was bra shopping a few weeks ago and lost it hysterically in the middle of the department store because I just wanted to call her and complain about how much I hate bra shopping. And I was like, every woman listening to this will understand, like, bra shopping and swimsuit shopping are not fun things.
Oh.
And I don't care who you are. And
that,
so
that happens to me a lot.
Yeah.
I forgot she died, and I was for my phone as a knee-jerk response.
Yeah. And
I lost it.
Yeah, I'm crying and I'm thinking, this is the craziest thing. I talk about her suicide, her life, her gifts, her struggles all the time. Why am I crying as if? And so that's an example I would say is my life wasn't better that day. I just wanted to talk to her about bra shopping, So if you're hearing this and you feel that you're holding on by your fingernails and you have decided somehow your children, your friends, your family, your spouse, that you're a burden, that you're not showing up because you're not your best, and that would be an option for you, please know that is actually the biggest lie ever, and we will never be better without you. So now we can talk about whatever we want to talk about. But
yeah, thank you. That's a good segue, actually, because the burden, I just want to speak to that for a second, because I've talked literally, I don't know how many people off the edge, so to speak, where they feel like they would be relieving people of the burden of them. And this one particular soul that I talked to, I'm so connected to this soul. And I said, you want to give a burden? You want to talk about a burden? If you were not here, the burden I currently feel being connected to your illness or what you perceive as a burden, you can multiply that by about 1,000, and then we'll talk about a burden. So it's you and I have the same messaging around that. Stay in your body.
Stay
in your body.
Yep. Stay in your body, because there's no one on the planet that's extra. And even in your struggle, you're a gift. And I know you're tired, but I amen everything you just said, because the burden and trauma in the wake of a suicide is like none other. So,
and the struggle remains with those you find. So, but we feel and we empathize and we struggle with you and we fight with you and get to the core of what's happening versus not having you here to do the detective work and the support around that. So, well, let's climb into being in your body in terms of, you and I had a conversation about how women internalize these feelings of not enough or worthlessness or whatever it might be. And somehow it's really, especially if you're a mother, it's really tied into where your children are currently at, socially, spiritually, emotionally, physically. So let's just kind of start first things first. What do you feel like is the biggest contributor to women feeling less than? And then we'll kind of go with it.
Okay. To start, I think we need to go one step closer to the core, which is all of us are of value and our worth is non-negotiable. So at the end of the day, on my very last breath, those triggers of guilt or shame that we struggle with, all of us every day, guilt to me is about a signal that the stove is hot, so I don't want to touch it because it's burning my hand. So it's a signal in my spirit that, oh, what I just chose to do, like gossiping, or when you're a little kid and you steal a candy bar, that feels yucky. It violates my spirit. I don't want to do that again. Versus shame, which is you're bad because you stole that candy bar. At the core, we are all children of imperfect parents. And then we grow up to become parents. And that perpetuates generationally some shame stories. And so I always like to start with, I'm always doing some major work on a core belief that may shock people. And that is, I'm worthless. At the end of the day, we're parenting from either a place of light or a place of dark. And the shame triggers in my parenting then change how I parent. And also it changes how I see how my children are behaving, right? Which then is the message back on me. So I think we start there for your listeners. If you were to get really clear about a moment in the last few days where you did not feel like you were your best parent self, and maybe it was around homework and finding out your child. I had one of my children that would get homework done and then somehow it would never magically get out of the backpack and get turned in, right? And we had fought and struggled to get the homework done, and somehow now, like, that moment of realizing this child can't get the homework turned into a story in my head about me as a mom. And my lack of ability to inspire, to support, to parent, to prepare, to protect. And then the story on my really vulnerable days turns into forever after that. It's not just about second grade or fourth grade or fifth grade homework. It's about he's going to go to prison someday. I mean, I could go there really, I mean, seriously, Cherie, I could get there super fast.
Me too.
Yeah. And I would tell teenagers when I had the chance to teach, I know that I would often say, when your parents are wigging out about your report card, it's because in their minds that D or F equals prison. And they're like, what are you talking about? And that's really coming from a place of, I have to go way back and be willing to do my work on my own core pain, which is that all of us had some messages, sometimes, and I think purposefully, from parents that didn't know better, that maybe shamed their kids because they didn't know another way to parent, but oftentimes inadvertently. I don't mean to give the message to my children that they have to be perfect to earn my love. I thought I was chronically parenting a different message, which was your love no matter what. And you can be honest in our home.
Don't you think that, I mean, I know your children, okay?
Yes,
and I know
do.
that you know really well my oldest son, who's now 22. And how old is Cameron? He's
21. So
21. They're like a year apart.
Yep.
And you were the one that actually gave my son Noah a love of yoga, because you taught that yoga class in his school.
And we would talk about this a lot in that yoga class, for sure.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, don't you think, there's a quote that I love, that your state of being is the environment your children are swimming in? And that's a lot
I love
on mom.
Well, I know. I was going to say, I love it and I hate it. I mean, I love it and I hate it.
Yeah. It's like, for me, I think I have really empathic kids. My older 3 children, who are 21, 20, and 17, they literally absorb the energy around them. If somebody is in a mood, they're feeling it.
Yep.
And that is the generation of children that, like, these millennials and under
are feeling.
Are feeling. And, I also have the 2 little ones, the 4 and the 6-year-old, who don't quite have the maturity to articulate their emotionality. They just express it.
Right.
So when I'm having a day, my kids pick up on that. They feel the energy, like the climate. Women are the climate controllers in the home. And we know that it's like a lot of pressure. So I used to, especially with the older kids when they were young, I used to hide that from them.
Yes.
Like, I used to either go do something or just put a face on, that was like, hey, but it was dissonance for them because they were seeing my affect and it wasn't congruent with what they were picking up on. And
that's a lot of where I was, because I grew up in a home where it didn't feel safe energetically, spiritually, emotionally, because there was so much volatility. I married a person that came from the opposite. It wasn't safe emotionally, spiritually, or mentally, because nothing was said. So I was determined to parent my children in a way that their environment always felt very safe and predictable. And so I did a similar thing. It was to suppress. And then I had one of my children, their energy really triggers me in a way, probably because he was my first, and probably because I was still working through a lot of, like, if I'm perfect, then no one will get hurt or lost, which circles back to a tie-in of what we already shared about then when my sister took her life. That shattered that, dream in my heart and soul. And it didn't serve him, but I mean, was I doing the best I could? Yeah. I mean, I had new boundaries, better boundaries than what I had grown up with. I think my mother would tell you that. My mother would say very openly what her struggles were with mental illness and how that translated in our home. I wasn't going to do some of those same things, but I've had to work with my daughter who's 15, who is very intuitive. And I do believe my son is too, but he's still learning that about himself in a different way. My daughter's more comfortable with it. And the language the last few years with her has been about authenticity and about realizing that, if I lose it, and what I mean by lose it is not what I grew up with, but in my mind, it meant the same thing. So if I expressed emotion or got upset or really felt like I couldn't articulate well what I was feeling, it was just that swirling. I think your listeners can relate to this, that swirling, like it's the last straw and it's too much and I'm not handling dinner time well. She's really good about saying to me, Mom, you're having a bad day. It's fine. It's not what you grew up with. Yeah.
My 3 kids, they're just the older 3. They're very private with their feelings because that's what I did. That's how I raised them. And now, just this last year, we just decided to get real. And then it became okay to shout at each other or whatever. Because I literally, this is no exaggeration, I wanted 0 contention in my home. That was my life goal.
This is why you and I are best sister friends, because of course that's what I wanted, because all I could see was what trauma came from constant contention. And so here I have a child that it took 7 years of infertility to get, which just messes up your kid in general, because then you're like worshiping them like they're the second coming of the Savior. And then and then you're going to be like perfect and never have addictions and depression, anxiety, conflict in your home. So your child can have this like cocoon to grow up and be safe and express their purpose. And then what happens was, even when I said, let's make sure we're always talking about this subject, so that the key things were always talked about. Like I was very clear that we would openly talk about sex. I was very clear we would always talk about uncomfortable feelings, because I knew what had happened in my extended family when that didn't get addressed. But somewhere along there, it was, I can't have emotion because it will set off the whole environment for the family, and then we'll be in trouble.
I really felt like, just to get really real, and my whole story with this, like my husband and I almost divorced last year about this time. And it was absolutely earth-shattering. My kids have never heard us have a real fight.
Wow.
And all of a sudden I'm filing for divorce.
Right.
And that was more traumatic to them.
Yes.
Because they're like, were you guys just being fake? Like, did you not love each other? And I had to go back and say, no, like I didn't model conflict to you. If we ever were going to have a disagreement, we took it out of the house. We went for a drive, because my parents fought a lot and they screamed a lot.
Yep.
And I just didn't feel that I could even put them in that place.
Well, and I would just say, for those that are listening, that contention is okay. I have a visceral reaction when I watch a movie with a scene where the adults aren't acting like adults and they are emoting as if they are toddlers in front of their children and not being responsible. And then thinking that is okay. That is not okay. And I don't think you or I are saying that at all. But I do think there's value in making sure your children see that there's conflict, disagreement, and resolution. That pattern is very rarely acted out in front of children. And so kids are either being raised by the parents that never fight, then they're all of a sudden divorced, or they're raised by the parents that are fighting all the time. And they think that's what love is too, that it's always contention and always turmoil. That if you're not in turmoil and in drama, you can't possibly be in love, because the parents in your family showed you that that's what passion looks like. And so I think it's really such a temperance to me, and balance is such a crazy thing, because within a family organic system, depending on the day, nobody in a family of even just 3 or 2 are going to be on the same page that day. So maybe 50% of the family that day is doing pretty good. The other 50% is doing really bad. And so I think that's what it means to be in a family culture. A family culture is a lot of, you know what, we're all going to try to get our needs met here, but sometimes someone else's needs is the priority, and or someone else's behavior is always sabotaging the family. So what's the difference between that? Right? Right.
Yeah. And every family, when you bring up the word culture, the root is cult. Every family is a cult. You can't leave. You're totally brainwashed. You're totally programmed. But the healthiest, I think what I've seen is, we talk a lot about boundaries. You talked about conflict and creating a space for there to be disagreements, varying viewpoints. I know in religious, really, really, really dogmatic religious families, it takes cult family to a whole other level, because if you don't agree with these ideologies, I don't know if I can love you. I don't know if I can have you be part of what we're about as a family.
Yeah. And I think too, it's important to understand that, like, one of the things that I love about being 48, which I just turned 48, is that you come to a place of middle agehood that I think gives you a backwards and a forwards perspective that isn't stagnant, but allows me to see, like, as a young mom, I was doing the best I could. And I thought that to be a good mom, it was defined this way, this way, this way. There's so much more out there now with just podcasting alone that allows people to have different framework of thinking around mothering, around their bodies, around their parenting, around marriage, around intimacy, around all that. I mean, you and I were being put into the zone of mothering with very little outside other than what we had grown up with experience, right? And so I think it's super wise. But I also watch some of the mid 30 moms in my neighborhood, and I'm tired for them already, because then the pendulum has swung the other way. There's always an Instagrammer that is telling you how your house should look, what your kids should be eating, and what you should be wearing. And so it's so
I
great.
cannot imagine. Well, I mean,
oh my gosh,
I'm parenting for the second time around, like with Eli and Emma, because there's 12 years between child 3 and child 4. But I don't even care to look.
I don't either care. I don't either. I know. I'm like, oh, is it Easter? Oh, should we be getting a new dress? Oh, I forgot. I didn't know we were supposed to do that.
Well, I was crazy though. Like, I didn't have, there wasn't
any of that. Yeah.
Social media with the older kids. And so I look at some of the behaviors, like I scrapbooked like an insane woman.
Oh, same.
I was like, and all of them had huge books. Like Noah, his first year of life is literally like 100-page scrapbook. I haven't even started Eli's, and he's freaking 6 years old, I
love it. Well, and I think it's really important to know that you as moms today have conversations now around words like shame, around words like connection and vulnerability and authenticity. We weren't talking about that. We were talking about potty training and teething and getting your baby to sleep through the night. And then all of a sudden it morphed into, and then how to lose all that weight after you have those babies. And now it's like organic this, and don't put this on your child, and do this and do that. And I just think that, first of all, we need to talk about giving ourselves permission to be works in progress. I guess that would be my first message.
Yes.
Is that I am chronically trying to write permission slips for myself every day. Permission to have feelings, permission to not have the choices of my children define my worth, or even as evidence of what I did as a mom or didn't do as a mom, right? Because some of the greatest people you can meet had crack moms that never even showed up. I always joke with my kids,
Oprah.
and no offense to all the people in the world that actually have struggled with crack or drug abuse. I'm not trying to offend, but I chronically tell my kids, like, when I'm saying, well, yeah, I'm checking in because I'm not a crack mom today. And then oftentimes I will say to them now, I'll say, listen, I have a shame story going on. One of my classic stories of that was a couple of years ago, my daughter had 2 sets of braces on her teeth. She has anyway, she has a complicated mouth, and she had wore the second set for so long, and she's really good at self-care. And we went to this kind of natural path dentist, and her braces come off and she has all these cavities. And they directly turned to me in the appointment and said, she's not getting the nutrients she needs. And so her body is pulling from her teeth. Oh my gosh, Sheree, I was in the biggest shame storm of my life because you know what? I don't do green smoothie, organic, whatever, juju every day and force it down in an IV in her body. I just don't. I'm like, did you have anything green this week? That's kind of what my approach now, right? And she gets supplements every day. And so I count it as good. I get her into a massage. She's got oils. She feels happy, but she's very self-directed. And so I was in this shame storm. We get in the car. She can see it on my face. And I'm trying not to cry and melt down because the fight in my head is what you and I were just talking about. Like, I don't want her to feel unsafe. I don't want her to feel like her mom is a crazy lunatic and have me lose it. I said, let's go to Target. We needed to get a few things. And she wanted to go to the makeup department. And I said, great, I need to go do a phone call. And I actually called Jenny, our mutual friend. I said, I need to go do a shame phone call. And she's like, okay, Mom, but remember, I have the ability to choose. You provide food in our home all the time and I get to choose. She's really wise. She's way more healthy than I am. So she goes off and I call my friend Jenny that and I'm like, oh my gosh. I know, she's the perfect shame story phone call. And I just told her this whole thing and she tried to check the facts. And so I realized, like, how many years did I do some parenting stuff where I would tell myself a story like that and I didn't call a trusted friend to check the facts. And Jenny gave me some facts checking. She just has said, if you had gone to maybe more traditional dentists, they would have just gone, yeah, she's had braces on for 2 years. That's what happens when you're going through puberty right at the same time. So there's a huge growth spurt, plus there's this metal on her teeth, right? But that's not what was said to me. And I internalized the whole story, right? Yeah. So I guess that's an example in a really, like, I've processed it now so I can talk about it, but there's ongoing things all the time where I've told myself a story about what it means to be a good mom. And then when my child shows up in their own life experience with their own dynamics and strengths and weaknesses and our family culture on top of that, then I tell myself a story. It's all about me.
And I've had those meltdown moments with some of my older kids where I'm like, where did I go wrong?
Yeah.
And they don't want that on them.
No.
Here's another thing they don't want on them. And this is another thing I'm really, really convicted about. They don't want to be the reason you don't show up to do your purpose. And I know you and I are super purpose driven.
And you know what's so funny? Full disclosure here. I think my child knows this. My son, the one that's close to Noah's age, just came home after 2 years in Africa serving a mission for our church. And while he was gone, it was a very healing, readjusting time. And he would even say he wasn't super homesick. And we always tell him, that's great. That means it was time for you to go. Like, that was where you were supposed to be. Of course, you were in line. I mean, he missed us, but overall. And I was really ultra nervous for a couple months before he came home because I felt like I had created this. We had a good rhythm at home, and I was very purpose driven in the work I was doing. And I felt like I was being authentic and stepping into this place that wasn't shrinking because for fear that I would ruin my children if I did my purpose too much. Right. And I also wasn't overcompensating because I'm of the age now where I say no 10 times a week to requests to do things because it has to feel purposeful for me. I'm not going to hustle. I'm not going to hustle anymore either. So I don't chase every speaking invitation or every podcast interview, or I just don't do that either. And so I was worried that this child for me is fabulous and beautiful, but he's got big energy and he's in a transition time, and I'm very public now. And a lot of his life experiences in books or is on TV or is because
I have the same. My kids are like, don't post that.
I know. And my son now, even at the university he's at, people will stop him and know who he is because they follow me. And so I was worried about that because he's in a transition time that is very much the baby adult transition of school, career, dating, leaving home, and then a very intense 2 years in Africa back to the United States in a very different culture here. And so I was worried. Well, last week he came to hear me speak to the law school, and I got invited to speak to the law school students that are married. And I didn't know if he would come, and I didn't know how I would handle that. And I walked in, and he got there early, and all of a sudden I could feel it. I was like, and I do a pretty good job of kind of getting in a place that's very grounded when I speak, because I feel the energy of everyone in the room. And I need to be clear that I'm not giving a message based on just someone in the corner, that it's authentic. And anyway, so I could feel it already. I was like, oh my gosh. And he sat right in the front. Like it wasn't, and the auditorium was lit. It wasn't downlight. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm going to see him. He's right here. And I tell stories about him if it feels appropriate. And so I thought, I don't know how this is going to go. And then I thought, you know what? I am not serving him. If he doesn't see me as myself, then he is not going to have permission to show up in his mission, in his life, the way he needs to, as he wrestles what that looks like for the future. Right. So I said a quick prayer, which I often run to some closet in a building and then say a prayer. And then I came down and they introduced me and I stood up, and the first few minutes felt a little clunky, somewhat because of just the arrangement of the room. It was because the law school, it looked like a Supreme Court chamber. And so there were like 7 Supreme Court chairs behind me, and that was weird. And I was just like, okay. And then all of a sudden I just got into my normal place. I mean, I've worked on that zone, that place that feels very sacred for me, where I tried very hard to share authentic messages that connect me to the audience and them to me. And I didn't know, I tried really hard to just not hustle for him. Afterwards, he came up to me and he was like, oh my gosh, who are you? And I was like, oh no, is this bad? Is this good? I couldn't tell. He says, Mom, that was amazing. Who are you? And I almost started.
Why don't you bring this energy?
I know.
Why don't you bring it all the time?
I know. And he goes, it kind of made me sad on the way home, because he said, I've never seen you that way. And I feel like I'm pretty authentic, true to who my spirit is when I'm in those situations. I'm not pretending. That's who I really am. And afterwards he kept saying it, and I almost couldn't comprehend it, because it was the opposite of what my fear was. My fear was he would be very critical, because he tends to be pretty opinionated in general, and that somehow I would shrink because of him. And he actually was inspired. And then he watched the people come up after crying and telling, he goes, do they always do that? I said, pretty much. And I realized what a gift it was. And he said to me, that's the thing I learned the most the last few years. You and Dad were people before you were our parents, and you had your own life experience. So how do we show that? Like you just said, I think you're brilliant at that, in showing your children that I believe in the value of home. There's nothing I think is more beautiful than to sit with my family, play a game, laugh, have an honest conversation about some political whatever post that went crazy on Facebook, and connect. Just as much as it is for me to stand on a stage and speak to 4,000. There's both parts of my spirit, right?
It's like you have to do it.
Yes, I do.
If you don't do it, you would be in bed all day crying.
I would. And I've dealt with some health issues, and people have often thought the pace I'm keeping is just insanity. And I say, I would be sick if I wasn't showing up authentically in this part of who I am. But Cherie, have you met women that isn't part of their soul? And I also honor women that are just like, you know what, right now, this season, that doesn't even, I don't feel like I'm not.
There's no drive. If there's no drive and no passion, then they're serving a different role and a different purpose.
Yes.
Not more efficacious in what we need on this earth. It's interesting you say that about your son, because I've taken Noah to Korea with me.
Yes.
To see me speak. And he's been with me to Australia. I've taken Sawyer to Japan. I made Sawyer speak in one of those things, and he's never forgiven me. But but what's interesting is that your children, like you were saying, like your children see you in a different light. They see you, number one, they see you as a human. They see you as a human at home, but you're in a different capacity. So you're in a different zone. But they get to see the contribution, and they get to see that by osmosis gives them the permission to pursue their own path.
I agree. And I think it's important to know, like my children know, at the end of the day, I don't value the praise of the world over my connection with them. And so they've heard me say no to things as well. And I remember a couple of summers ago, my daughter happened to overhear a speaking request phone conversation. And she said, "Did you just say no?" And I said, "Oh, I love you. Did you think I don't ever say no?" And she said, I just didn't know. And I said, "Sweetie, I value just as much, but there's both parts of my spirit." And I love that the daughters of today have both. It's that I want to be an archaeologist and a mother. It's not an either or, it's an and. And I also say to college age women that come to me and they're trying to make decisions about career and family, that it's okay to have seasons. I have a season in my life right now where it does feel synergistic. Now, I'm not saying I'm walking around in balance every day. Please don't get that message, because
we never will get there. That's an illusion.
No, that's an illusion, because balance is literally on a balance beam, constantly moving and adjusting. And so I think we get a sense that balance is like a place on a map, and it's not. But I have said to young women that have asked that advice, because they seem to look at my life and go, "Oh my gosh, you have books and you're speaking and you have a family and a marriage and you take care of your health." And I just say, well, first of all, those are all stewardships. Those are all stewardships in my life that I've learned that if I don't give attention to, like, my health, that will crack and break. And if I don't give attention to my marriage, that will crack and break. But if I don't give attention to what is uniquely, creatively my contribution in the universe, which right now looks like books and speaking, I will crack and break too. And so, and then giving permission, because I think so often we judge other mothers and wives and women, and we say, well, wait a minute, she's playing her life out and her career this way, and it looks very different than mine. Okay, great. Because heaven forbid God placed every single one of us on the planet to do the same thing. That would be horrific, right? So
yeah,
I love that you message about this in a very clear way. You message about this all the time, about it is your divine source, is your God, whatever way you define it, talking to you enough and regularly. And are you listening that you can make those balance adjustments in a way that don't shut down a key part of your soul just because whatever society is saying or whatever your neighbor is doing.
Yeah. And I think the healthiest family cultures, let's face it, there's some beautiful men out there who are really striving to create a culture in their homes, but it's mostly the woman. Come on, it's mostly the mother.
Yes.
And so, and if you're a single mom or whatever, you can still, you have it in you. So it's ideal to have the masculine balance, but you have a masculine in you too. So I always speak to that with single mom. But anyway, the healthiest family cultures I've seen, and this is like life goals, right? For me, because I have a spectrum 22 down to 4. I'm actually 4 kids at home right now. My daughter's the only one that doesn't live at home. She's 20 and going to school. But I love when there's openness.
Yes.
And this is just a new aha for me. Like, everything that I see in spiritual teaching is all about authenticity and vulnerability and openness. And, we've got the Brene Brown stuff. And we've got all this. And people are being really, really forthcoming on their social media posts now in a healthy way, not in a I want an attention way. So for me, if we transfer that into the home, maybe sitting around the dinner table at night and saying, "Hey, this is where I messed up today. Where did you mess up today?" And, "Oh, remember yesterday when we were having that conversation and I kind of went off and I was distracted and I wasn't paying attention to you. I kind of processed that this morning and I'm really sorry." Not making dinner time heavy in that regard, but making it light, and it doesn't have to be dinner time. It could just be casual conversation. But I'm mentioning dinner because that's when everyone is together in family therapy for the most part, or at least that's the idea. And I notice when there's a conversation around, what did you learn? But not just what principles did you learn, but what did you learn about yourself? What did you learn about what kind of reserves within you or tools did you use to get through that? And looking back, I kind of wish I'd done that with the older kids when they were younger, because we could have, but you can't do that.
Yeah. And I think what you said is so key, that there's all this talk about Brene Brown and authenticity and vulnerability. I quote her. I did a live radio show today and quoted her twice. But if we're really honest about what that looks like, is it's uncomfortable. And so we can talk about it in this way that it's like an ideal Facebook or Instagram post, but what does that translate like into daily life? And when you're sitting and having a conversation in a family, one of my favorite new ways to put words around what you just described at the dinner is to circle back. And so I've started using that. Like, can we circle back? I don't value how I showed up with you yesterday. Can we circle back on that? And giving permission. My daughter is really quick to say, you know what, I do not know why I just was so sassy a few minutes ago. And she's very quick to say, I'm sorry for that. That's not how I value acting. But just having language around that, your listeners just hearing that. I remember the first time I heard the word circle back, I was like, oh my gosh, that's not like rocket science. Why haven't I ever used that word before? Or validation in our home is always being practiced because it's not fixing. It's just listening and validating, not empathizing, not, oh, I'm so sorry. It's validating. And the other thing I've learned is that your needs don't necessarily always, most of the time, can't be met. My trusted validators are not within my home. They are outside people that can be very objective, that aren't triggering me and I'm not triggering them. And so you can create a really healthy, vulnerable, authentic, validating family culture, but you're still going to be responsible, likely, to get truth and clarity and clear up distortion from somebody outside of your home. It's not going to, your spouse can't be responsible for meeting every single need and processing every single distortion you've got going on,
Yeah. And I love the idea of bringing people, while we're talking about Brene for a little bit, like she has this term that just hit me like right in the core of my soul. And she calls some systems are about weaponized belonging. So emotion-driven approach to having a forced accepting of ideologies in order to belong. Like if you don't follow the family rules, you don't belong with us. So you're either for us or with us, or you're against us.
Right. Which from an anthropological standpoint, that's what kept cultures surviving. Right. But it doesn't serve. Right.
If we have that, and sometimes it's an unspoken thing that kids just maybe pick up on. If I don't do it this way, I'm not going to be accepted. But people don't know enough and they give up. They say, oh, well, I don't want to rock the boat. Yep. So she also talks about silence encourages the tormentor. So it's like, if you just try to make it okay and put on the face and whatever, they're sensing that if you don't open up and say, no matter what you believe, no matter what you do, no matter how you respond, no matter what you do or don't do or whatever, you belong here. And there's a place for you at the table, no matter what.
I was just talking about this on another show that belonging, and Brene has talked about this a lot, like teaching your children that fitting in is not the goal. If you go to a school with a whole bunch of bank robbers, you don't want to tell your kids, when your kids come home and say, I don't have any friends, then maybe have them check the facts and say, well, you don't want to fit in there. You don't want to fit in with a bunch of bank robbers, which obviously fifth graders aren't running around robbing banks generally. But the point is, make it so extreme that they see that they belong in a family, right? There's a sense of belonging there, that they have a safe place here, depending on 7th grade friends versus 10th grade friends, that they will always have a place at the table. On the flip side of that, though, I think children are wired from a progressive standpoint to not let their parents know too much, because they are trying to preserve what their parents think of them, like with the baby adult stage, right? They are trying to go out and be independent on their own. And there's this sense of survival that comes from pulling away from the family culture. That too is hard to navigate. That's not even about secrets. That's not even about, do we practice vulnerability in our family? That's just about a sense of self-reliance and independence that I'm navigating right now. Like, our son came home and after 2 years of being gone was home for 3 weeks over the holidays and moved out to start kind of his life. And we sat down with him and we just said, Kate, we've raised you. And he looked at us like, what? And I said, and don't get so far down the river without a paddle. Like, we're here. But I've not seen a lot of what young single adult college parenting information out there. There was tons about how to potty train.
Your grandma had some advice,
Yeah. Yeah.
And your mom was doing the best she could. There's so much enlightened parenting. And I was big into the attachment parenting. I tell people this all the time. They don't believe me, but it's absolutely true. My first 3 kids never had a bottle, never had a pacifier,
Oh
and
my
a
gosh.
crib. I'm not kidding you.
So the enmeshment.
Attachment parenting manuals before I had
Yes.
Noah. And it was all about, it's me or nobody.
Yes.
And so I'm literally not kidding. They never took a bottle, they never had a pacifier, and they never spent a night in a crib.
Yeah, and I think that's the point. So now you're parenting in 3 different stages, and I'm parenting in 2. And my first one, I've never done it before. And so, like you said, you have this lens of attachment parenting. And when he came home, I said to him, I've never done this. People keep asking me to write a book about parenting college students, and I don't know what it's like. And so he says, Mom, we'll just figure it out. So I chronically say this to him. I think I just gave you unsolicited advice. I take that back. And he'll start laughing. It diffuses the situation. The other day he called, and I was like, oh, this is why grandma cries when I just call her. And he goes, are you just so happy? I'm so happy to just hear your voice, you know? And then he said something, and immediately I gave advice, and I said, okay, delete everything I just said. I think that was unsolicited, because I'm trying to honor his journey of finding his own values. Right. And then the other thing I've said to him is, I don't see a lot of examples I'm following. Like, I feel like I see a lot of examples of parents of baby adults that are doing too much. And so they're never kind of finding their own way. And then I see others that are so hands off that they're floundering, because it's a hard time of life, that you still want some home base to go to and some reassurance that you're doing okay. And I keep telling my son, like, I want to find the middle ground. I want to be honest with you that we did the best we could. And now you're going to start learning things that you're going to think, like, my parents were idiots. Why didn't they, and I had a friend say, that's our family doctor, he will not ever come to you and praise God for everything you did until he's holding his own child in his hands. And then he will.
And I've learned this in business too. Like, we're not the bringer of everything.
Yes.
Just because you might be in a partnering or in a stewardship, you are not the exclusive resource. And that was something I had to really process as a mom, like, every opportunity, every this, every that. And finally, I'm like, it takes a village.
Right.
And you know what? Even just being able to say to your kids, you know what? I don't know.
Yes.
I don't have to bring that to you. Go track it down. Like,
yeah. Or that I told my son, my 21-year-old, like, I don't want to move back home with my parents because I would start to atrophy. And so please understand that this is one of those processes that's going to be unveiling for a while, and God's got a plan for you. And I've got to keep being okay with the vulnerability that I'm not your answer for everything. Because especially with our trauma that you and I both share, there is this like ingrained trauma for me that is like, if I can do everything perfectly, then I can save the people I love and I won't lose them.
That's it right there. So when my sister died, I had 3, 5, and 7-year-old.
Right.
None of their DNA was expressing, none of the, all 3 of them have struggled with depression and anxiety at different times. But when they got to that stage, I mean, that hovered over our family culture. My sister's death, you better believe it. They were close friends with their cousins who were the same age. And so they knew that was hovering over them.
Right.
And so I got triggered when they showed the slightest signs of depression, because like you said, your kids are going to be in prison if they don't if they get a D or an F. That's where my mind went, like, they're going to kill themselves tomorrow.
Listen, my son reached out for some support from someone else that I trust. And that person was holding confidence a couple of weeks ago. And finally, this friend said, oh, you're telling yourself a story about what he shared with me. And I said, yeah, I am. And it hit me that the story was really scary, and it had to do with suicide and death. It just did. I mean, it just did. And so this friend was wise enough to say, no, it's nothing that you don't know. It's not that. And so you're right. I think we heal. I mean, the story from the Bible that I love to talk about is Abraham and Isaac. because Abraham, if you know the backstory, Abraham's father tried to sacrifice him. And so when God, if you follow the Old Testament at all, when God said to him, now go do what was your trauma, I have friends that are atheists that is the whole reason they don't believe in God, because they think there's no way there's a God that would ask that of Abraham. Mm-hmm. And I say, reframe it in a way that you see that God was trying to get Abraham out of the trauma of his childhood. And the way he did that is he asked him to walk back through it. And then there was a bullock in the thicket that came. And it was God directed. It wasn't what his father had been doing, which was a totally different purpose. And so oftentimes our children trigger for us the worst of our stories and our trauma from our childhood so it can be surfaced and healed. And
absolutely.
Oh my gosh. And that's messy business.
And all they're doing really is mirroring back. So
that's it.
Because they're so empathic as well. Like we always called Noah the barometer of the home. Because whatever was the pervading feeling or whatever, he was manifesting in his body.
Yeah.
So our children really are our greatest teachers. And as we've kind of been talking through this, kind of leaning towards, developing a healthy family culture, for me, it really comes down to how do we manage fear? How do we manage the unknown, the great unknown, how we're going to react if knee-jerk reactions are going to come up, if we're going to go into a depressive cycle, if we're going to lose something, all this fear.
Right.
And for me, and I think you'll agree with me on this, like when you manage that as a woman, not a mother, when you climb into that as a woman with direct access to the creator, your God, however your higher power, however you define that, when you align with that in the management of your own fear as a practice, you literally model that to your children. And it doesn't have to be perfect. That's the glory of it. We have bodies. There's a quote I love by Naomi Wolf. She said, mothers, I'm going to totally probably not get this completely right, but mothers who model self-acceptance vaccinate their children against low self-esteem.
Yes. Yes. And I would also say one of my takeaways for your question on that is, are we willing to understand our own pain and triggers so that we don't offload it on our children? But have we created a support group for ourselves, which only needs to be 1 or 2 people? It does not need to be a long list of people that you can circle back with on your own terms so that you're able to process some of that shame or whatever's coming up because your child doesn't get accepted to college or flunks out of 7th grade or maybe even is abusing drugs at the time right now, and that's playing out for you. I always say to parents that call and want help and support, I'm like, well, what are you doing working on you? And they're like, no, I want advice on my kid. No. What are you doing on you? And they're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, because you're only so good as you are for your child, and your child is wanting you to have that boundary and somewhat of a full well to share any water you might have with them. And so I think my biggest tip, in addition to what you just said and being super clear, is knowing that you have some resources, some podcasts, some friends that you can call and say, you know what, this just came up for me. What am I missing here? So that you can go back and show up in your child's face, and their choice, their struggle is not always about you, which is complicated when we know that a lot of what is happening in a family is because we're interdependent upon each other.
And I think the unhealthiest cultures, whether it's an extended family culture, whether it's a school culture, whether it's a religious culture, are the ones who are trying so very, 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 very hard to look like it's all together. Like, it's like, this is what you can aspire to.
Mm-hmm.
And no one ever quite gets there.
Yes.
And if I just did more of this stuff, then I'd have this totally healthy body, family, church,
whatever it is,
everything. And
it's not a cake recipe. It's not a cake recipe. This is life and living. And like Mary Oliver said, listen, are you breathing just a little and calling it a life? Like if we're really breathing, isn't that crazy? Powerful. Listen, are you breathing just a little and calling it a life? Like if we're really breathing in life, it's going to be rough sometimes, but it's also going to be glorious, you know? And
Mm.
so what I've had to learn is that I can't fully love and show up and be loved if I'm half of me showing up. And part of half of me was some of the shadow work that I didn't want to have my family see at all. I feared too much not being perfect in my family more than outside of my home, for sure. I'm super authentic outside my home, but in my home, that's where it would get really crazy because these people felt like extensions of me. And so I don't want to end up just like, not to say Mary Oliver again, she just passed away. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. Like that would be my biggest regret.
Or the like dying with your music inside
Yeah,
you, not being
yes,
fully there. Because you and I both meet a lot of people who are still with us,
yes,
but they're
yes.
not with us.
But they're not with us. And I think I've said that to my son as he's been making decisions about his own future and career. I've said to him, son, part of what you will struggle with will be your great gift to the world. And so I've had to learn, and I hope I've modeled that somewhat for my children, that they've seen me take some of my pain and it has become the gift in my life. On the flip side, there's no, like, I used to think as a young mom, oh, if I can just get my kids to this point, if my family can just look like this, then I can deeply breathe in and out and it will be okay. And what I'm learning in the last few days for me, my vulnerability is skyrocketing right now. And there's a lot of transition happening in our family right now. And there's a lot of change. And with that comes a lot of vulnerability. And I was kind of word vomiting on my husband this morning, and he did a brilliant job of not fixing it and just validating, which was huge for us, right? And I remember thinking when I got off the phone, I hate feeling this vulnerable. And yet the surrender to that vulnerability allows me to also feel the greatest joys. It's both. It's both. And to create a world in which there's no vulnerability, some people choose to numb with drugs or other choices. Other people choose to just barely breathe in and out and make their world so small that they've limited in their minds this vulnerability. And what I've come to know and trust is that God has me. He has my children. He has the people I love. And he has a plan that is not going to get messed up by me. That's
right. We don't have that much power.
Yes, 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 yes. It's not going to be messed up by me. I heard.
Yeah. And what you were saying, like women, we need each other.
Yes.
Each other. So that we may not want to vomit something on our kids, but you and I could get on a Marco Polo.
Yes.
We have and saw.
Which I have. I've reached out to you and said, the greatest pain, I need to put words on this, and thank you. So if you're a mother or a woman listening to this right now, because the saddest thing for me, I think you would agree in all your travels, is to meet an 85-year-old woman who does not have connection anymore. And she has decided that she failed miserably based on what her kids have turned out to be. That has been the most heartbreaking thing to witness over the last 2 years. I've seen it really regularly in speaking events and in conversation and in work I do. And I am determined not to be that. I want to be the 85-year-old grandmother that has learned to love so unconditionally that all she feels is that love. And everyone in her family and an extended family is not some version of what she's dictated them to be. It's who they came to be. And
I love that. Let's be old together and
yes, and that's what I was
books
gonna
and
say.
travel. And
Yes, and that I could still sit on a porch with you and talk with you, like that there will still be meaningful connection in my life. And that may mean that you need to, as a young mom, find an older woman to be a woman in your life, because I value women ahead of me on the trail. I value that.
Absolutely.
I value the sacredness of a woman turning to me and saying, do you see me frenzied? No. Because all those teenagers grew up and they married people, some of which I didn't want them to marry. And some of my grandkids scare me, and my husband already died. And look. And you see the beauty on their face because they are not frenzied. I want that.
There's a couple of women I look at that are really old. Marion Woodman's one of them. And I think she just passed away too. Mary Oliver is a beautiful poet that you quoted.
Yes.
But Marion Woodman, she was a fighter for the souls of women. She was, I think she was a sociologist. Maybe she was an anthropologist, but she brought women into the sovereignty of their souls. And she talked about how, and she was old, like she was in her like 70s and 80s, and this wisdom's just coming out of her. And I just would hang on everything she said. I have all of her books, but you and I, girl, we could keep going.
We're going to have to do part two, whenever you want. And I need to have you on my podcast because I just love the work you're doing and the voice that you give, to some of the parts of our souls that we're not always able to articulate.
Likewise, you're doing a work that is so niched into saving.
Thank you.
Souls. And I think, you and I have both learned this. You can't really save anyone. You can only love them.
Yes. And influence it. And
yes.
It's not influence is I'm going to say this for the first time publicly. My close friends know this. I choose 2 words for the year instead of New Year's resolutions. And they become compasses that allow me to lean towards or cultivate instead of some checklist that allows for flexibility in goal setting so that you're making goals for that week or that month, not for the whole year. And so my words this year, one is faith and one is influence. And I fought influence for a long time. I called that same Jenny friend one day and I said, God has said 3 times the word is influence. And I hate that word because I thought it meant like followers on Instagram or YouTube, which I have those platforms. She said, no, it's the way you're trying to parent. It's the way you're trying to influence around suicide prevention. It is not about saving and controlling. It's about influence. It's about showing up, sharing your light, and it allows it to be an influence for someone else to go in the direction they need to go. And so when I redefine the word to not mean how many followers or subscribers on YouTube that I have or how many books I sell, that the word really was about a different stewardship instead of ownership with my children, that has changed. That is the word I keep trying to bring up every day. Am I doing this out of control or am I doing this out of influence? And if I choose to do that from a place of love, it allows for so much more joy to show up in my family. It just does.
Yeah. And I think your 2 kids are so, I just look at them as they're just wise and they're beautiful. And
thank you.
And I think too, even if they weren't, right?
Yes.
I would still look at you as like doing the work that is, again, we could do a whole thing on attaching how the children's outcome is a reflection on who you are.
Well, and I've had to come to peace with really boldly in some of the trauma that has happened in our family the last few years, that could I stand before God? That's how I defined my spirituality and the source of creation for me, and tell him that I have done everything I can to stay present as a mother in the lives of my 2 children, which I see as great gifts and teachers in my life. Yes.
Yeah.
And guess what? That doesn't require their choices to match what I dream for them or perfection in me. And that has been a really huge freeing awareness to have the last few years as my child had to leave home and then kind of transition back a little bit, that I have to know in my core level that I know I did. Now I know more today. Your greater light and knowledge hopefully will be next week, and it won't be today. And so I can't turn back time and go, oh, when I was 27 and I was a brand new mom, why didn't I do A, B, or C? Because now I'm 48 and I know something different. Right. That's never going to happen. I hope the last day I'm breathing on the earth, I'm gaining light and knowledge. I hope I am. And that means that there's got to be an element of forgiveness in all of our relationships, especially for ourselves and especially with our children. Then they have the freedom to mess up and it doesn't destroy my universe.
Yeah. And just giving them the permission to express and learn and be, heaven knows that my process was messy. I can't expect that my children wouldn't have another.
I know. I remember all the time, like we survived and to this day, I don't want my mom to call and fret and tell me that she's so afraid I'm going to fail. So why do I show up that way with my kids so often still? I do. And that's why we need girlfriends. That's why we need friends. Trusted, I call them faith friends. My faith friends help me check that. I can tell my faith friend like you a story in my head and it loses its power and its sting. And then I can show up to my 21-year-old and go, yeah, I totally think you're going to figure this out. You're going to be awesome. It's great. It's great.
Yeah, I think instilling the confidence, the trust in them. You're going to get this. You're smart. You're bright. You're connected.
It's the greatest gift we can give our kids.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to end with a quote that I love. And I don't know who said it. It probably, it feels so universal. Anyone could have said it and we wouldn't need to quote them. But you may not be the perfect mother, but you are the perfect mother for those souls in your home.
Amen.
So even my sister that took her life, she was the perfect mother for those 5 children when she had them.
Because I know some of those children and what they've done with that experience has been beautiful to watch.
And it was all known.
Yes.
And just one more thing, so we don't give the idea that we've got it going on and we're these emotionally healthy parents with all these perfect boundaries in our home. If you are in a space of regret, meaning our listeners, that maybe you missed the mark. Maybe you have a child who's an addict. Maybe something's going on that you've internalized or you shoulda, woulda, coulda. Please know it was perfect. Yeah. It was perfectly imperfect. And you are awakening and you can choose to be in a space of, okay, that's what it was. And here's where I'm going now as my own sovereign soul in connection. And I am firmly entrenched in the ideology. I don't even want to call it an ideology, a deep spiritual principle that you impact more people. You have more influence when you shine, when you clear, when you do the work. And children learn best through modeling. This is known in many family systems, cultures. Yeah, it's children learn best, and this is researched heavily with behaviorists as well as cognitive theorists. Children learn best by through modeling.
Yes. Which means, like you said at the dinner table conversation, to pull it back full circle, the greatest gift to show your children is when you walk into the room and say, I am so sorry. I do not love how I just handled that. Can we talk again? Can we circle back again? Like, to have a culture of giving permission to mess up, try again, I think is life-saving for families and for our spirits.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, my dear.
You're welcome.
Friend. This is so needed for me. This was like therapy. Thank you.
I know. I'm like, okay,
Send me your bill.
Yeah, no. And I'm so grateful. This is why connection is crucial to our happiness, right? Because scrolling and liking on Facebook is not this at all. It's not this at all. This is where
this is it.
Yeah. This is where humanness is beautiful and messy and perfect. And thank you for being a great mirror to the world. So thanks for inviting me.
Loves.
Love you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Ganel-Lyn, for keeping it real. She's a dear friend, and we have many discussions around this topic. It's never ending. I don't think we ever arrive at becoming an amazing matriarch or mother. We want to create this beautiful culture of inclusion and belonging and acceptance, and that is a lifetime effort. Follow Ganel-Lyn on Facebook. She's very active there, and she also has amazing books always coming out and collaborative things in the works that are truly inspiring and bringing women to that place of deep self-acceptance. Also, can visit my website. I've got a really cool course launch coming up, an online course called Emotional Wholeness Masterclass. So check it out on my programs section of my website. Talk to you next time.